You won't believe why the drums suddenly stopped that night. At the height of the Festival of Echoes, the night air was thick with the smell of roasting yams and burning palm wood. Tano stood before the entire village, his chest heaving as he pounded the sacred drum. The firelight danced across his dark skin, casting long, wild shadows against the sun-dried clay huts. The rhythm was a living thing, shaking the damp red laterite soil of the valley. Every villager moved to the beat, their bodies swaying in perfect harmony under the vast, starry sky. Tano raised his heavy wooden beaters, ready to strike the final, echoing blow that would secure his place as the village's greatest musician. But then, right in the middle of the most powerful beat, the drums abruptly stopped. There was no grand sound. The heavy beaters struck the stretched animal skin, but only a flat, dead thud followed. The silence that fell over the village was violent and absolute. The dancers froze in place. The elders gasped, clutching their wooden walking sticks in shock. Children stopped playing and screamed, hiding behind their mothers' thick woven wrappers. The village chief, Tano's own father, fell to his knees in the dust, his eyes wide with sudden terror. From the back of the terrified crowd, an old woman whispered into the cold night air. "The ancestors have turned away." The chief slowly rose, his voice shaking as he declared to the crowd that someone had deeply offended the spirits. Every eye in the courtyard slowly turned away from the silent drum and fixed upon Kojo. He was the quiet, humble apprentice who swept the shrine and cared for the instruments. Over the last few months, Kojo had rapidly improved, recently impressing the villagers with his natural, effortless skill. Standing near the edge of the firelight, Kojo shrank back as the heavy stares of his neighbors fell upon him. Tano stood over the sacred drum, his stare burning with raw, unfiltered accusation. He pointed a thick finger at the young apprentice. The village chief stepped forward, his royal robes dragging in the red dust. He raised his hands to quiet the frantic whispers of the crowd. He announced that a drum of this sacred magnitude did not simply lose its voice without a cause. He declared that only a dark, intentional betrayal of their customs could silence the ancient instrument of their forefathers. The wind seemed to chill as the chief's harsh words echoed against the mud walls of the compound. Kojo's heart hammered furiously against his ribs. He had done nothing wrong, yet the weight of the entire village's suspicion pressed down on his shoulders. The chief extended a trembling hand, pointing directly at the young man in the shadows. With a voice that allowed no argument, Kojo was ordered to step forward and stand before the entire village. Kojo stepped into the bright, flickering light of the central fire. His hands trembled, but he kept his head held high. With a clear, steady voice, Kojo swore by the bones of his ancestors that he had done nothing to harm the drum or offend the spirits. He denied the unspoken accusations swirling around him. But the murmurs only grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a dry bushfire. Tano paced around the silent drum, his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He stopped and looked at the elders. He subtly suggested that he had seen Kojo walking near the edge of the forbidden forest at dusk. He planted the dark idea that Kojo had been practicing forbidden, dark rhythms in the woods to steal the festival's glory. The villagers gasped at the thought. The joyous celebration that had filled the valley just an hour ago was completely gone. In its place, a thick, suffocating fear settled over the people. The festival food sat untouched, and the fires began to burn low. The chief looked between his proud son and the trembling apprentice. Unsure of the truth and fearing the wrath of the spirits, the chief raised his staff. He postponed the sacred festival indefinitely, declaring that no one would celebrate until the absolute truth was revealed to them all. The bitter roots of this night had been planted exactly 3 weeks earlier. It was a bright, hot afternoon, and Kojo was sitting alone on a smooth rock near the rushing river. Believing he was entirely alone, he pulled a small, carved wooden drum into his lap and began to play. His hands moved with incredible speed and grace, creating a rhythm that perfectly matched the flow of the water and the singing of the birds. It was beautiful, pure, and filled with life. Villagers returning from the yam fields paused on the dusty path, utterly mesmerized by the sound. They dropped their baskets and closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Even the village elders, who were normally strict and critical, nodded their heads in deep approval. But hidden behind a thick patch of giant ferns, Tano watched. On the outside, he kept a polite, stiff smile, but inside, his blood was boiling with toxic jealousy. He gripped the rough bark of a mahogany tree so hard his knuckles turned gray. Tano was the chief's son. He was supposed to be the best. As Kojo finished his song, Tano overheard an elder whisper to another, "The quiet apprentice has a gift from the gods. He may soon surpass the master." Those words cut into Tano's heart like a rusted knife. That very evening, Tano stormed into his father's private quarters. The chief was sitting quietly, carving a piece of ivory. Tano paced the room, demanding reassurance about his future role in the village. He reminded his father that he was the rightful heir, the one trained since birth to lead the drummers and carry the village's spiritual heartbeat. The chief set down his carving tools and looked at his son with tired, ancient eyes. He did not offer the blind support Tano desperately craved. Instead, the chief spoke firmly, insisting that true leadership and spiritual respect must be earned through humility and skill, not simply inherited by blood. He warned Tano that pride was a heavy burden that would eventually crush the man who carried it. Tano left the room feeling utterly empty and deeply angry. He felt his guaranteed inheritance, his status, and his power rapidly slipping through his fingers. The thought of bowing to a lowly apprentice like Kojo made him sick to his stomach. He could not let Kojo take his place in the history of their people. That night, when the village was completely asleep and the moon was hidden behind thick, dark clouds, Tano walked alone. He avoided the main paths, moving silently toward the sacred shrine where the village's ancestral drum was kept. Under the pale, weak moonlight that finally broke through the clouds, Tano forced open the heavy wooden door of the drum house. The air inside was stale, smelling of old leather and sacred oils. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, where the massive ancestral drum sat upon its carved wooden pedestal. Tano ran his shaking hands over the smooth, dark wood of the sacred drum, carved generations ago from a single, massive tree. For a brief moment, he hesitated. He knew that tampering with this instrument was a massive crime against everything his people believed. But then he remembered the faces of the elders smiling at Kojo by the river. His face hardened, the brief flash of guilt replaced by a cold, calculating rage. From a small pouch tied to his waist, he pulled out a thick, carefully carved wooden wedge. He reached his arm deep inside the hollow body of the drum, feeling for the exact center of the instrument's resonating chamber. With a forceful push, he jammed the wooden block tightly against the inner wall, effectively killing the drum's ability to echo. He pulled his arm out and dusted off his hands. Staring at the ruined instrument, he whispered into the darkness, "If I cannot lose, neither can he win." Back in the present, the tense aftermath of the broken festival dragged on. The morning sun brought no comfort to the terrified village. The elders gathered around the silent ancestral drum in the center of the square. One by one, the oldest and wisest men attempted to strike the drum with the ceremonial beaters. Every single attempt was met with the same dull, lifeless thud. It was as if the spirit of the drum had simply died inside the wood. Desperate to prove his own purity and deflect any lingering suspicion, Tano grabbed a smaller, regular drum from a nearby stand. He began to perform loudly, his hands moving aggressively to create a flawless, booming rhythm. He looked at the crowd, silently demanding their approval and loyalty. But the villagers barely noticed his skill. Their fearful eyes remained locked on the sacred drum, which sat stubbornly dead in the dirt. Tano's performance felt hollow and arrogant compared to the heavy spiritual crisis they faced. Finally, the oldest elder raised his hand, silencing Tano's loud playing. The elder leaned heavily on his staff and declared that human hands could no longer solve this mystery. He insisted that they must send for the blind seer who lived deep within the forbidden forest to uncover the truth. Deep in the damp, shadowy heart of the forest lived Nana Adwoa, the blind seer. She was an ancient woman with deep textural wrinkles and silver-white micro-braids that dragged on the forest floor. When the village messengers arrived at her small hut, they found her already waiting. They carried the heavy, silent drum and placed it at her feet. Nana Adwoa did not need eyes to see the problem. She knelt in the dirt and pressed her ancient, wrinkled ear against the cold wood of the drum. She tapped it gently with one long fingernail and listened to the tragic, muffled sound. She stood up slowly, leaning on a branch carved with protective symbols. Her milky white eyes stared blindly into the distance. "The drum did not lose its voice," she said, her voice raspy but carrying immense power. "It refused to speak. It has been gagged by a heart full of shadows." The village messengers trembled, stepping back in fear at her ominous words. Nana Adwoa turned her head toward the path leading back to the village. She issued a strict, unbreakable command. She demanded that the village chief bring both the accused and the accuser to her clearing in the forest at the exact moment the sun rose the next day. Later that afternoon, Kojo sat alone at the edge of the rushing river, exactly where he had played so beautifully weeks before. The water tumbled over the smooth rocks, but the sound brought him no peace today. He stared down at his rough, calloused hands, questioning his own soul. He wondered if Tano was somehow right. Had he let pride sneak into his heart? Did his desire to play somehow anger the ancestors and taint his spirit? Kojo closed his eyes and prayed desperately to the sky, asking the spirits for clarity and begging for a clean heart. He washed his face in the cold river water, hoping to wash away the heavy doubt that clung to him. He was a simple apprentice. He never wanted a war for glory. But Kojo was not truly alone. Hidden quietly behind the thick, green reeds on the opposite bank, someone was watching his every move. The watcher crouched low in the mud, breathing silently, observing the young man's moment of extreme emotional vulnerability. As the wind shifted the reeds, the watcher's face was briefly illuminated by the setting sun. It was Tano, his eyes dark and calculating, studying Kojo to ensure the young apprentice was completely broken before the final test. The next dawn, the air was cold and heavy with mist. The village chief, Tano, and Kojo stood nervously in Nana Adwoa's forest clearing. A small crowd of elders had followed them, their faces tense with anticipation. Nana Adwoa stood beside the sacred drum, her blind eyes fixed on the morning sky. She declared in a booming voice that the drum must be touched by both young men, and the wood itself would recognize the hands of the guilty. She commanded Tano to step forward first. Tano confidently wiped his sweaty hands on his wrapper and struck the drum hard. Nothing but the same dead, flat sound echoed back. He stepped away, a smug, satisfied smile barely hidden on his lips. Then Nana Adwoa pointed a bony finger at Kojo. Kojo hesitated, his whole body shaking with terror. He walked slowly toward the sacred instrument. He didn't hit it. Instead, he gently placed his open palms against the stretched animal skin, closing his eyes in deep respect. As his skin made contact, the drum gave a sudden, faint, trembling echo. It wasn't a full beat, but a deep vibration that hummed through the damp forest air. The crowd gasped violently, stumbling backward. The chief's eyes went wide, and he immediately demanded a full explanation for what they had just witnessed. Before the chief could speak further, Tano erupted into a furious rage. Seeing the drum respond to Kojo terrified him, so he went on the attack. He pointed aggressively at Kojo, shouting so loud the birds fled the surrounding trees. Tano accused Kojo of using forbidden forest magic to manipulate the spirits and trick the elders. He claimed Kojo had cursed the drum to make himself look like a chosen savior. The villagers, already terrified of the supernatural silence, easily gave in to panic. They recoiled from Kojo, pulling their garments away, as if his very presence was infectious. Even the chief, who had tried to remain impartial, looked at Kojo with deep, growing doubt. The fear of dark magic was too strong to ignore. Kojo stood entirely alone, tears welling in his eyes as his community turned their backs on him. He had no defense against their blind terror. But Nana Adwoa slammed her wooden staff hard against the dirt, demanding silence. She turned her blind face toward the angry crowd and spoke with ultimate authority. "The drum does not lie, but neither does it tell half-truths," she proclaimed. "Return to the village. The drum will fully reveal the truth tonight, in front of the great fire." Panic gnawed at Tano's insides as he returned to the village. The seer's promise that the truth would be fully revealed that night terrified him. He knew that if the drum was somehow opened or properly inspected, the wooden block he had jammed inside would be discovered. As soon as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Tano left his family's compound. Alone and moving like a shadow, he sneaked back to the sacred shrine to remove what he had hidden. He reached the heavy wooden door of the drum house and grabbed the iron handle. He pulled with all his strength, but the door refused to budge. He braced his feet against the mud wall and yanked harder, but it felt as though the wood had magically fused shut. The hinges were completely locked by an unseen force. Sweat poured down Tano's face as panic fully set in. He clawed frantically at the edges of the door. Then he froze. From inside the locked shrine, he heard a sound. It was a low, steady vibration, coming directly from the belly of the ruined drum. It was humming on its own. Tano backed away slowly, his blood running cold, realizing that the ancestors were now awake. The night of the final reckoning arrived. The entire village assembled in the central square, forming a massive circle. The ceremonial fire in the middle burned higher and hotter than ever before, throwing violent orange sparks into the dark sky. The sacred drum had been magically transported from the locked shrine and now sat perfectly in the center of the flame's light. Nana Adwoa stood beside it, looking like a spirit herself in the glowing firelight. She raised her arms, and the terrified murmurs of the crowd instantly died away. She commanded absolute silence from the people. Turning her blind eyes toward the village chief, she extended a long, bony finger. She instructed the chief to step forward and manually open the sacred drum. The chief hesitated, deeply afraid to break a sacred relic, but he dared not disobey the seer. As he took a nervous step toward the instrument, a strange sound stopped him in his tracks. A sharp cracking noise echoed through the silent square. Nobody was touching the drum, yet the thick, ancient wood of its base began to splinter. The crowd watched in pure horror as the sacred instrument began to crack completely on its own, driven by an invisible, immense pressure from within. With a sudden thunderous split that sounded like lightning striking a massive tree, the bottom of the drum cracked wide open. The force of the rupture sent a cloud of red dust into the air. From the dark, hollow belly of the ancient instrument, a single object was violently pushed out. It fell heavily into the dirt, rolling until it stopped perfectly at the feet of the village chief. It was a carved wooden wedge, jagged and forcefully shaped to block the drum's inner vibration. Gasps rippled through the massive crowd. The villagers stared at the block of wood, realizing instantly that the silence of the drum was not a mystical curse from Kojo, but a deliberate, physical act of sabotage. The physical proof of absolute betrayal lay right before their eyes. Across the circle, Tano's proud, angry face completely drained of color. His jaw went slack, and his knees visibly shook beneath his rich, ceremonial garments. The physical object he had carefully hidden was now resting in the light for everyone to see. The protective walls of his lies were crumbling instantly. The village elders stepped forward, inspecting the wedge, their faces hardening with deep anger as they realized a human hand had desecrated their most sacred artifact. The fire crackled violently, the only sound in the tense courtyard. Nana Adwoa stepped over the broken drum and pointed directly into the crowd. Her raspy voice demanded to know whose hands had carved the wedge and placed it inside the sacred chamber. All eyes darted nervously around the circle. Tano took a step backward, his mouth opening and closing as he stammers weakly, trying to form a denial that wouldn't come. Kojo stood quietly on the opposite side of the fire, saying absolutely nothing, letting the truth fight for itself. The firelight flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows across the panicked faces of the villagers. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural gust of wind swept through the center of the square. It blew directly toward Tano. The strong wind grabbed the edge of Tano's loose ceremonial cloth, whipping it forcefully toward the flames. As he panicked and grabbed the burning fabric, his heavy leather belt was completely exposed to the light. Tucked securely inside the loops of his belt were tiny, freshly carved with shavings. They perfectly matched the exact color and texture of a jagged wedge lying in the dirt. The crowd saw the evidence instantly. The wind had exposed the undeniable truth of his crime. The heavy weight of spiritual dread and public exposure finally broke him. Under the crushing pressure of 1,000 staring eyes, Tano's legs gave out. He collapsed into the red dirt, his fine garments instantly soiled. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, and finally confessed to the terrible crime. His voice cracked as he admitted everything to the horrified crowd. He screamed that he had been absolutely terrified of losing his status to a common boy. He confessed that his deep, consuming fear of being forgotten and replaced had driven him to desecrate the sacred drum in the dead of night. He had wanted to destroy Kojo's moment of glory at the festival, but he never expected the spirits to intervene. The entire village fell silent again, but this time it was a silence born of deep sorrow and disappointment, not fear. The people looked at the crying man in the dirt, their once proud leader now reduced to a pathetic, jealous criminal. The villagers turned their eyes toward the village chief. The burden of justice now fell entirely on his tired shoulders. He had to decide the ultimate fate of his only son, who had betrayed both his family and the gods. The village chief stood over his son, tears streaming down his weathered, scarred face. It was the hardest moment of his long life, but he knew what his duty required. He raised his staff, his voice thick with grief but unwavering in its authority. He declared before the gods and his people that pride acting against the ancestors was an offense that could never go unpunished, regardless of royal blood. With a heavy heart, the chief announced that Tano was immediately and permanently stripped of his title, his inheritance, and his rank as the lead drummer of the village. The elders nodded in solemn agreement. Tano wailed in the dirt, but no one moved to comfort him. The punishment was harsh, but the village had survived a terrible spiritual crisis. However, as the chief turned away from his disgraced son, a heavy realization settled over the crowd. The truth had finally been revealed and the guilty man punished, but the sacred drum, the heart of the village, was still lying split open and completely broken in the dust. The deep wound to their community's spirit had not yet been healed, and the silence still hung heavily over the valley. Nana Adwoa walked slowly through the quiet crowd and stood before Kojo. The blind seer pointed her staff at the broken pieces of wood in the dirt. She commanded Kojo to step forward and repair the sacred drum. The elders watched closely, expecting the young man to eagerly seize this moment of ultimate glory. Instead, Kojo slowly shook his head. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, refusing the honor. Before he would touch the sacred wood, he bowed his head and spoke to the ancestors. He asked for deep forgiveness for any hidden pride that might have existed in his own heart. He confessed that he, too, was flawed, and begged the spirits to purify his intentions before he attempted to heal their instrument. The elders were profoundly moved by this raw, honest display of humility. It was the exact opposite of Tano's arrogant entitlement. Even the chief wiped his eyes, recognizing the true spirit of a leader in the young apprentice. Satisfied by his pure heart, Nana Adwoa nodded her approval. With trembling but determined hands, Kojo finally reached down and lifted the heavy, cracked pieces of the ancestral drum from the red earth. Kojo sat by the fire, working with quiet, intense focus. Using natural tree sap, strong hemp bindings, and his deep understanding of the wood, he carefully brought the cracked pieces of the drum back together. He worked with steady, respectful hands, treating the instrument like a wounded elder rather than an object. When the final binding was tied, the drum looked different. It bore the scars of its breaking, but it was whole again. Kojo took a deep breath, picked up the ceremonial beaters, and struck the skin gently. A deep, powerful rhythm instantly exploded through the dark valley. It was not the flat, dead sound from before. The boom was incredibly rich, vibrant, and stronger than it had ever been in the history of the village. The sound rolled through the earth, shaking the leaves on the mahogany trees and vibrating in the chests of every person present. Kojo's hands flew over the drum, pouring his soul into the music. The wind seemed to catch the rhythm, carrying the healing sound farther into the forest than any drumbeat had ever traveled. The ancestors were finally answering back. The Festival of Echoes immediately resumed, but the atmosphere was completely transformed. The fear and tension that had poisoned the village were entirely washed away by the booming, joyful music. The villagers danced with a renewed, desperate energy, their feet pounding the dirt in time with Kojo's flawless playing. The rhythm felt incredibly pure, honest, and free of the toxic competition that had previously tainted their music. Even Tano, still sitting in the dust at the edge of the firelight, stopped his weeping. He watched Kojo play in completely humbled silence, finally recognizing the undeniable, divine gift the young man possessed. As the music reached its glorious peak, Nana Adwoa struck her staff against a rock, calling for one final moment of attention. The dancers paused, panting and smiling, looking toward the blind seer. The ancient woman raised her face toward the starry sky, preparing to speak one final prophecy to the gathered people. The village waited with bated breath, knowing her words would shape the future of their community for generations to come. Nana Adwoa's raspy voice carried clearly over the crackling flames. "You all believed the ancestors abandoned you," she said, looking blindly across the crowd. But the ancestors stopped the drum not in anger, but to prevent a massive lie from leading this village into the dark. She explained that if the drum had played that night, Tano's pride and deceit would have been permanently cemented as the ruling force of their people. The silence of the drum was not a curse meant to terrify them. It was a desperate act of protection from the spirits. The ancestors had literally held their breath to force the poison out into the light. A wave of profound realization swept through the villagers. The people finally understood that the terrifying silence had actually been a massive blessing in disguise. The spirits had deliberately saved them from corrupt, jealous leadership that would have eventually destroyed their community from the inside out. They looked at the broken and repaired drum, realizing it was now a symbol of truth surviving deception. The next morning, the village chief issued his final ruling regarding the structure of the drummers. As a vital part of his poetic justice and rehabilitation, Tano was officially assigned to serve as a lowly apprentice. But he was not just any apprentice. He was ordered to serve directly under Kojo, the once proud royal heir who had worn the finest silks and demanded the respect of elders, now wore a simple, coarse weave tunic. His daily duties included sweeping the shrine, oiling the wood, and carrying the heavy drums for the very man he had so violently envied and tried to destroy. The humiliation weighed incredibly heavy on Tano's shoulders. As he walked through the village, carrying Kojo's instruments, children pointed, and the adults whispered. But Tano kept his head down and did the work. He knew in his heart that the punishment was entirely deserved. He had tried to steal a gift he did not earn, and now he had to learn the value of the music from the very bottom of the dirt. Despite the terrible things Tano had done to him, Kojo did not use his new power to exact revenge. He treated his new apprentice with unexpected grace and quiet dignity. When Tano struggled to carry the massive festival drums, Kojo did not laugh or mock him. He simply adjusted the straps and showed him how to bear the weight properly. When they sat together to clean the instruments, Kojo spoke to Tano with respect, focusing only on the sacred nature of the work. This absolute lack of cruelty deeply confused Tano at first, but slowly, it began to break down the hard, bitter walls around his heart. Without the constant pressure to prove his royal superiority, Tano found a strange peace in the simple, repetitive labor. By watching Kojo's gentle, dedicated nature every single day, Tano finally began to truly understand the deep meaning of humility. He realized that true greatness was not about standing above others, but about serving the community and the ancestors with a clean, honest heart. Months passed, and the village fully healed from the wounds of that terrible night. The drums sounded frequently again, echoing beautifully under the peaceful, silver light of the full moon. But the music in the valley had fundamentally changed. The rhythm now carried a perfect, healthy balance. The arrogant, aggressive pride that had once dominated the musicians was entirely replaced with a deep spiritual purpose. Kojo led the drummers with wisdom and grace, always ensuring the music honored the ancestors rather than the men playing it. Beside him, Tano beat a smaller rhythm drum, his face calm and focused, his jealousy burned away by the hard lessons of the past. The villagers danced without fear, knowing their leaders were honest and true. The scarred, repaired ancestral drum sat proudly in the center of the shrine, a constant, physical reminder to the people that broken things can be made stronger, and that the truth will always find a way to echo through the darkness. The narrator closes. The drums only fall silent when the truth is buried deep in the shadows. The people of the valley learned that when the music stops, it is not a time to panic, but a time to search your own soul. Silence does not mean the absence of the spirits. Sometimes a deafening silence is simply the ancestors waiting patiently for someone to find their courage. They wait for the brave to stand up, face the fire, and speak the hard truth that everyone else is too afraid to whisper. Kojo's humility saved a village, and Tano's broken pride taught a generation what it truly means to lead. The scars on the sacred wood will remain forever, a testament to the night the spirits held their breath to save their people. If the drums in your life suddenly stop completely, what hidden pride would they be exposing?